Hola chicos! Over the past 2 days, we have been working with affirmative to commands. However, there's a couple other things we need to talk about in regards to commands. So over the next couple days, we're going to have our feet in like 3 different camps. We'll be talking about commands. We'll be talking about the different types of pronouns in Spanish, like reflexives, indirect object pronouns, and direct object pronouns. Just a heads up, if you don't remember your indirect object pronouns and your direct object pronouns, I highly recommend that you go back through and find the double object pronoun notes from chapter 8 from first semester. They will really help you out this chapter. And we're also going to be talking about accent marks. So all 3 of these components are all going to come together here in a few days to form perfect commands. They're going to merge together just like this. Today, we are specifically going to talk about accent marks while you watch this video. So again, this video is focusing on accent marks. We will practice with commands and we will review pronouns for a little bit in class together tomorrow. Now, let's talk about accents. First off, what is an accent? What does it do? What's the point of an accent mark in Spanish? We use accents to help determine what syllables are stressed when we pronounce words. So today we're going to talk about a couple rules of Spanish accentuation, how we know what syllable is stressed or emphasized when we pronounce a word. Words all have stress, even if they don't have a written accent mark. No matter what you pronounce, you put emphasis on certain syllables more than others. Think about it in English. What's the difference between present and present? Wind and wind? Wound and wound? It all depends on our vowel sounds and what kind of emphasis is placed on them. The same rule kind of applies in Spanish, but there are actually 3 specific rules that are especially specific to Spanish that we are going to talk about today. Our basic accentuation rules. You need to memorize these. There is no way around it. You have to memorize these 3 rules. It will make your life very, very easy if you memorize these rules. So, rule number 1 tells us that if we see a written accent mark over a vowel, so A, E, I, O, or U, we always stress or emphasize that syllable, no matter what the other rules are going to tell us. So if we see a written accent mark, that accent mark dominates the other 2 rules that we're going to talk about. Rule number 2 says that if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. Rule number 3 says if a word ends in a consonant other than N or S, the last syllable gets the stress. These rules are great and it's fine and dandy, but we need to identify and define what a syllable is in Spanish. Normally in English, when we're trying to count syllables of words, we just clap it out, right? Potato, 3 syllables right there. In Spanish, we're just going to count our vowels. Again, in Spanish, we are just going to count our vowels. A vowel is the equivalent of a syllable. Okay? So let's look at a couple words. We're going to look at 9 words together, and we're going to determine where we put the emphasis or stress on the following words according to these 3 rules. I will circle the vowel that gets the stress, and then I will also write down the rule that tells us why that vowel is stressed. So if we look at number 1, postal. When we pronounce postal, how do we know which syllable gets the stress? Let's look at our last letter. Our last letter is an L. L is a consonant, which is not N or S. So according to rule number 3, this A is going to receive the stress. Postal. We emphasize that A because rule number 3 tells us if a word ends in a consonant other than N or S, the last syllable gets the stress. Number 2, carne. Carne ends in a vowel. According to rule number 2, if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. So we have this E as our last syllable, which makes this A our second to the last syllable. So for carne, the A receives the stress or emphasis. Let's look at reloj. Reloj ends in a J. According to rule number 3, if a word ends in a consonant that is not N or S, the last syllable gets the stress. So the very last vowel in this word is going to receive the stress when we pronounce it. Reloj. Okay, emphasis on that O. Examen. Examen ends in an N. So according to rule number 2, if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. So we're going to count. That's our last syllable. Here's our second to last syllable. That A is going to receive the stress when we pronounce examen. Zapatillas. Zapatillas ends in an S. According to rule number 2, if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. So this A is our last syllable. We'll count one more back and we get that I. Because rule number 2 tells us if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. Ventana. Ventana ends in an A, and rule number 2 tells us if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. So that means the first A receives the stress because it is the second to the last syllable. Primero. Primero ends in an O, and according to rule number 2, the second to the last syllable gets the stress. Because primero ends in an O, the second to the last syllable will receive the stress. Lápiz. Awesome. Lápiz ends in a consonant other than N or S, so rule 3 tells us that the last syllable would get the stress. But wait, there's something not quite right about lápiz. What do you notice about lápiz? Do you notice there's an accent on this A? What does rule number 1 tell us? When we see a written accent mark over a vowel, A, E, I, O, or U, that syllable always gets the stress. So even though this ends in a consonant, there's an accent mark, so we have to ignore rule number 3. And that A will receive the stress. Last one, televisor. Televisor ends in an R, which is a consonant other than N or S, so our last syllable will get the stress. Take a couple minutes and answer the next few questions about where stress falls in each of these words. Be sure to explain your answer and cite your rules. We have talked about the 3 different rules of Spanish accentuation in this video. Let's really quick recap them. Rule number 1 says when you see a written accent mark over a vowel, A, E, I, O, or U, always put stress or emphasis on that syllable no matter what the other rules below say. Written accent marks dominate all the other rules. Rule number 2 tells us that if a word ends in a vowel, N or S, the second to the last syllable will get the stress. Rule number 3 says if a word ends in a consonant other than N or S, the last syllable gets the stress. We are going to continue to talk about rules of accentuation and identifying where accents and stress fall in words tomorrow in class. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify where the stress falls in Spanish words. Adios!